The life of General George Patton Jr. was defined by conflict. He was known throughout the world as a masterful combat commander, leading men and machines with aggressive speed and decisive action. Yet, when the Great War in Europe finally ended in May of 1945, the commander of the United States Third Army found himself confronting a peace for which he was entirely unsuited. This transition from the relentless pressures of warfare to the intricacies of post-war military governance proved to be General Patton's most difficult battle. His final months revealed a profound psychological and professional struggle as a warrior accustomed to command discovered that his usefulness in the new political landscape was rapidly diminishing. The circumstances surrounding his final days, ending in the sudden and fatal automobile accident, are essential for understanding the complex character and enduring legacy of one of the greatest military figures of the 20th century. His story is not just one of military achievement, but also a poignant narrative about the difficulties faced by highly effective war leaders when the requirements of peace demand diplomacy and administration over decisive battlefield aggression. The end of the war did not bring the general pleasure. In fact, he was deeply depressed. Even before Victory in Europe Day, General Patton had lobbied powerful and influential figures in Washington, District of Columbia, hoping to be reassigned to the Pacific Theater. He desired to continue commanding combat troops. However, this ambition was thwarted because, as he put it to his Third Corps commander, Major General James Van Fleet, there was already a major leader, referring to General Douglas MacArthur, in that theater, and only one star could lead the show. General Patton also held grave concerns regarding the rapid reduction in the strength of the United States Army in Europe, believing this demobilization invited disaster. Just before the war officially concluded on May 7, 1945, he pleaded with the visiting Under-Secretary of War, Robert Patterson. He urged the maintenance of force and strength, suggesting the need to keep boots polished and bayonets sharpened to present an image of power to the Russians. He asserted that force was the only language the Russians understood and respected. The general's views on the post-war situation were stark and immediate. He warned Patterson that if the United States failed to maintain its military strength, they would have won the victory over the Germans, yet simultaneously lost the war. Patterson, in response, told General Patton he did not comprehend the overall large-scale picture. When Patterson asked General Patton what he proposed to do concerning the Russians, the general allegedly provided a radical answer. He suggested that the United States Army should remain intact in Europe, delineate the border with the Soviet forces, and then, if the Russians refused to withdraw behind that designated line, the American forces should push them back across it. General Patton felt that the purpose of the United States' presence was not to acquire jurisdiction over people or countries, but rather to restore to those nations the right to govern themselves. He forcefully stated that the job needed to be finished immediately while the American military was ready and present, or else it would have to be completed later under less favorable conditions. Predictably, such aggressive ideas were entirely unacceptable to the politicians in Washington, District of Columbia, and even to the vast majority of American soldiers still stationed in Europe whose sole desire was to return home. Stories detailing General Patton's interactions with the Russian forces became legendary, although some of these accounts may be untrue. On May 13, 1945, General Patton reportedly hosted and decorated the commander of the 4th Guards Army during a luncheon held in Linz, Austria. General Patton recorded the event in his diary, noting that after a substantial amount of heavy whiskey drinking during and after the meal, the Russian commander went out cold, while General Patton himself was able to walk away under his own power. He described the Russians as a scurvy race and simply savages, expressing confidence that the American military could beat hell out of them. The following day, General Patton was entertained by Marshal F.I. Tolbukin, a Soviet Army Group commander. General Patton recorded that Tolbukin attempted to get him drunk. General Patton described Tolbukin as a very inferior man who perspired profusely. He did concede, however, that the Russian soldiers put on a tremendous show, passing in review with an impressive imitation of the goose step. General Patton remarked that the officers, with only a few exceptions, looked like recently civilized Mongolian bandits. One of the most widely reported incidents allegedly took place toward the end of May. An English-speaking Russian brigadier general arrived at General Patton's headquarters, demanding the return of some riverboats on the Danube. These boats contained German personnel who had previously surrendered to the United States Third Army. General Patton reacted dramatically. He reportedly pulled a pistol from a drawer, slammed it onto his desk, and shouted for the son of a bitch to be removed. He raged, asking who had allowed the Russian bastards into his headquarters. Once the Russian officer was escorted out, a shaken General Patton is said to have declared that sometimes a person has to put on an act. He concluded that they would hear no more from those bastards, and apparently they did not. Just 3 days after Victory in Europe Day, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower called a conference of all his United States Army commanders. Eisenhower instructed them not to publicly criticize any of the campaigns that had resulted in the war's victory. He stressed the need for solidarity, especially if any of them were called to appear before congressional committees. General Patton's private reflection on General Eisenhower's speech is recorded in his diary. He wrote that the speech seemed to have symptoms of political aspirations, focusing on cooperation with the British, Russians, and Chinese, particularly the British. He speculated that this emphasis on cooperation might be intended to cover up potential criticism regarding strategic blunders that General Eisenhower might have committed during the campaign. Patton was unsure whether the mistakes were his own or a result of excessive cooperation with the British, although he leaned toward the view that General Eisenhower had overly cooperated. General Patton settled into his new headquarters in Bavaria, where he served as both military governor and commander of the Third Army. His headquarters was located in a former Waffen-SS officers' training school in Bad Tolz, approximately 30 miles south of Munich. General Patton renamed the barracks Flint Kaserne, honoring Colonel Paddy Flint, an old friend and one of his regimental commanders who had been killed in action in Sicily. General Patton's personal residence was a palatial house situated on nearby Lake Tegernsee. This house was quite luxurious, featuring a swimming pool, a bowling alley, and 2 boats. It had previously been owned by Max Amann, the publisher of Adolf Hitler's book Mein Kampf. Interestingly, the wife of Gestapo chief Heinrich Himmler also lived in a different house on the lake, as did the wife of the notorious Waffen-SS Kampfgruppe commander Jochen Peiper. In early June, General Patton received the news he had been hoping to avoid. He was ordered back to the United States for a 30-day tour to sell war bonds. On June 7th, his airplane, which was escorted by a formation of fighters and Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, landed at an airfield near Boston. He was greeted by an honor guard, a 17-gun salute, and the governor of Massachusetts. The American press had generated massive excitement, guaranteeing him a hero's welcome. In a somewhat surprising gesture, General Patton chose to return the governor's hat-doffing salute by removing his own helmet, which displayed his 4 stars and the emblems of the 3rd and 7th Armies and I Armored Corps. Following the official formalities, he finally embraced his wife, Beatrice, marking their first hug in nearly 3 years. They were then driven through the Boston suburbs to a ticker-tape reception held within the city itself. The procession route, which stretched for 25 miles, was lined by an estimated 1 million people. People wept openly, and girls tossed flowers toward him. Later, addressing a crowd of up to 50,000 people before the Hatch Memorial Shell, General Patton delivered a speech. He stated that his name was merely a hook upon which the honors were hung. He asserted that the great ovation given by Boston was not for General Patton the general, but rather for General Patton as a symbol of the Third Army. The day after the parade, the Daily Record newspaper published headlines announcing a frenzied Hub Hiles Patton and stating that Gen Patton in tears at Hub tribute. The second headline referenced General Patton breaking down emotionally during a speech given at a state dinner held in his honor that night, overcome by the heartfelt tributes. Beatrice, General Patton's wife, reportedly declared that she could hardly speak, being so overcome by the wonderful and proud day. However, during his first speech that morning, General Patton had unfortunately made another major error in judgment. He told his audience that the fact a soldier was killed in action often made him a fool rather than a hero. Although the exact meaning of his remark remains unclear, it naturally enraged individuals who had lost relatives in the war. The War Department soon began to receive a flood of telegrams and letters demanding an apology from the general. They never received one. The day following his Boston return, General Patton and his wife flew to Denver, continuing on to Los Angeles and Pasadena. In all 3 cities, he gave emotional speeches. 100,000 people, including numerous Hollywood stars, came out to hear him speak at the Los Angeles Coliseum. This level of adulation from the public, his family, and his friends continued throughout his leave.
Yet, to his military superiors, General Patton remained a potential source of embarrassment, seen as a missile that could deviate from its intended course at any time, and therefore requiring strict control. With this concern in mind, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson kept a tight rein on the general during a press conference in Washington District of Columbia on June 14th, allowing General Patton only to add a few brief comments regarding the Germans and the Third Army. Fortunately, the primary official objective of General Patton's month-long leave was successfully met. His enthusiastic and compelling oratory helped to sell millions of war bonds. He even received a letter of thanks from Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. However, his personal ambitions remained unfulfilled. His repeated attempts to secure an appointment commanding troops in the Pacific Theater had failed again. Although his name was included on a list of 6 generals submitted by the War Department for consideration by General MacArthur, the Supreme Commander rejected General Patton immediately. General Patton's past indiscretions, coupled with the misstep during the Boston speech, continued to plague him. During a visit to Walter Reed Hospital in Washington District of Columbia, he turned on the press reporters who were following him. He challenged them, saying, "I'll bet you goddamn buzzards are just following me to see if I'll slap another soldier, aren't you? You're all hoping I will." His daughter, who worked at the hospital as an occupational therapist in the amputee ward, later recounted that when General Patton saw the soldiers there, he burst into tears. He cried out that if he had been a better general, most of the men would not have been injured. The men, who were not seeking sympathy, actually cheered him as he departed. Shortly before his return to Germany, General Patton visited his daughter Bee's home in Washington. While his wife was momentarily absent, he is said to have predicted his own death to both of his daughters, Ruth Ellen and Bee. He confided in them that he believed his luck had finally run out.
In early July, while in Paris, General Patton again confided in his close friend Everett Hughes, expressing relief to be back in Europe and away from the United States. This sentiment persisted despite an army order banning dependents, which prevented his wife, Beatrice, from accompanying him. General Patton's morale received a boost when his aircraft was provided with a fighter escort for its flight back to Bavaria. Furthermore, troops and tanks were positioned lining the route from the airfield leading to Bad Tolz. He noted in his diary that being back among soldiers gave him a very warm feeling in his heart. Despite this temporary lift, General Patton remained pessimistic about Europe's future and displayed reluctance to become involved in the intricate challenges of military government. Perhaps more critically, he was hesitant to implement the extensive purging of Nazis. He was convinced that Europe would soon succumb to communism. Regarding the Nazis, he pointed to practical concerns. He reasoned that his soldiers were fighting men, and if he dismissed German clerks and sewer cleaners, his American soldiers would be compelled to take over those necessary jobs. He argued that they would have to manage telephone exchanges, power facilities, and streetcars, tasks that were not appropriate for soldiers. Essentially, General Patton was prepared to overlook a German individual's prior Nazi affiliation, provided that person possessed the required qualifications for a specific position. This approach stood in direct opposition to the political directives he had received from General Eisenhower concerning the denazification of the American zone of Germany. His problems were further complicated by Washington's determined effort to quickly demobilize its combat soldiers, thereby shrinking the supply of skilled American manpower available for administrative roles. By his very nature, experience, and background, General Patton was fundamentally ill-suited for the demanding role of military governor. He simply lacked interest in the minute details necessary for rebuilding a country. He showed little tolerance for the thousands of displaced persons, whom he scornfully described as too worthless to even cut wood to keep themselves warm. His worsening anti-Semitism, combined with his deep despair over the fate of Germany, led him into profound sadness and melancholy. He recorded his bleak outlook in his diary. He feared that if the German people and Germany itself were starved and allowed to completely disintegrate, they would certainly embrace communism. He warned that the communist takeover of Germany would effectively write the final chapter for democracy in the United States. Reflecting on his survival of the war, he lamented, "The more I see of people, the more I regret I survived the war." He even accused the United States Treasury Secretary of enacting a Semitic revenge against Germany. The Potsdam Conference convened on July 16th.
General Patton traveled to Berlin, dressed resplendently in his uniform, adorned with 20 stars and his iconic ivory-handled pistols, to witness President Truman presiding over the raising of the American flag in the United States sector of the divided former German capital. The two men did not establish a good rapport. President Truman later wrote in his diary that he struggled to understand how a country could produce great men like Robert E. Lee, John J. Pershing, General Eisenhower, and General Omar Bradley, yet simultaneously produce figures such as Custer, General Patton, and General MacArthur. General Patton did not enjoy his time in Berlin. On July 21st, he wrote a letter to his wife, Beatrice, expressing his feelings. He wrote that they destroyed what could have been a good race and were now preparing to replace them with Mongolian savages. He lamented that the horrors of peace, pacifism, and unions would have unlimited sway. He wished he were young enough to participate in the next war, finding the idea of killing Mongols to be real fun. He concluded the passage with the sorrowful thought that it was hell to be old and passé and know it. In his period of despondency, General Patton retreated to activities he genuinely enjoyed and performed best. He focused on overseeing the training and discipline of his army. He enjoyed reading, writing, and hunting. For physical exercise, he added a squash court to his residence. However, the cessation of hostilities with Japan only intensified his low morale. On August 10th, he wrote in his diary that another war had concluded, and with it, his usefulness to the world had ended. He concluded that all that remained for him was to wait for the undertaker and posthumous immortality. General Patton's biographer, Carlo Dieste, speculated that the general's extraordinary behavior and increasing sadness might have been caused by brain damage. This damage could have resulted from a lifetime of head injuries sustained from falls off horses and various road accidents. The most serious of these incidents was an accident that occurred in Hawaii in 1936, which had resulted in a 2-day period of unconsciousness. Dieste added, however, that the exact cause would never be confirmed, as General Patton's wife, Beatrice, refused to authorize an autopsy on his body following his death, despite an official request from the Army. In September, General Patton returned to Berlin to attend a military review hosted by the famous Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The general had certainly not lost his quick wit or his legendary audacity. Zhukov pointed out a new, massive, and highly advanced Stalin IS-3 tank. He mentioned that its cannon possessed a range of 17,000 meters. General Patton reportedly replied to his host, "Indeed. Well, my dear Marshal Zhukov, let me tell you this. If any of my gunners started firing at your people before they had closed to less than 700 yards, I'd have them court-martialed for cowardice."
Despite General Patton's ongoing indiscretions and his perceived lack of dedicated interest in his administrative duties, the situation in Bavaria was not entirely negative. In August 1945, Secretary of War Stimson judged Bavaria to be the area with the best governance in the entire United States European theater of operations. This positive assessment was apparently shared by Stimson's deputy. However, any satisfaction General Patton might have derived from this favorable report proved to be brief. Things began to rapidly decline for him in September. During the beginning of that month, General Patton decided to visit several prison camps located within his administrative zone. These camps held hardened Nazis and former members of the Waffen-SS. Camp 24 at Auerbach, situated 100 miles northeast of Munich, housed ex-members of the 12th Hitler-Jugend SS Panzer Division and the 1st Leibstandarte. Previously, the senior German officer at the camp had complained about the unbearable treatment of seriously disabled comrades. Those complaints had been rejected by the Americans. When the officer mentioned the Geneva Convention, he was reportedly told that he seemed to have forgotten that they had lost the war. However, Hubert Meyer, the former chief of staff of the Hitler-Jugend, recalled that General Patton's visit brought about a significant change. General Patton, after verifying the accuracy of the complaints, immediately ordered corrective action to be taken to rectify the situation. Furthermore, he went beyond mere policy change, ordering that the starvation diet be supplemented with American Army rations. One former senior German officer had described the existing diet as not enough to live on, but too much to die on. An incident that would have profound repercussions for General Patton's military career occurred on September 8, 1945, at Camp 8 near Garmisch-Partenkirchen, 60 miles south of Munich. Following his inspection of the American garrison responsible for guarding and administering the camp, General Patton met the German commander of the prisoners. The German commander complained that some prisoners were being unjustly interned as political prisoners. General Patton is reported to have told the accompanying American officers that he considered the internment of these individuals to be sheer madness. Unsurprisingly, one of the American officers present, who was Jewish, reported the incident to Eisenhower's headquarters. The headquarters was located in the IG Farben building in Frankfurt and was known as Headquarters United States Forces European Theater. The complaint was directed to the desk of General Eisenhower's Civil Affairs Officer, Brigadier General Clarence Adcock. Brigadier General Adcock subsequently briefed General Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. General Smith then sent the report detailing the incident to General Eisenhower, who was on leave in the south of France. The report was accompanied by a cover letter in which General Smith expressed his belief that General Patton was out of control in Bavaria. General Smith urged General Eisenhower to return and address the matter personally before further damage could be inflicted. General Eisenhower returned to Europe and met with General Patton at Lake Tegernsee on September 16th. They conversed until 3 o'clock in the morning. However, there is no documented record indicating that they discussed General Patton's controversial role as military governor. They did, however, discuss General Eisenhower's eventual successor. General Eisenhower, the former Supreme Commander, was scheduled to return home in November to take over as the Army Chief of Staff at the conclusion of the year. When General Patton learned that General Eisenhower's likely successor was his deputy, General Joseph McNarney, he expressed his lack of desire to serve under a man whom he claimed had never heard a gun discharge. General Patton indicated that the only jobs he would be interested in were Commandant of the Army War College or Commanding General of the Army Ground Forces. General Eisenhower informed him that both of those positions were already filled. General Patton recorded in his diary the grim sentiment, "I guess there is nothing left for me but the undertaker." A week later, General Eisenhower made another visit to Bavaria following reports describing the terrible conditions in several displaced persons camps within General Patton's zone. The reports were accurate. General Eisenhower discovered not only appalling living conditions, but also found German guards, some of whom were former SS men, overseeing security. General Patton attempted to justify the situation by explaining that the camp had been acceptable before the arrival of the current Jewish occupants, who were, in his words, pissing and crapping all over the place. Despite being abruptly ordered to shut up, George, Patton apparently continued, mentioning that there was an empty village nearby which he planned to convert into a concentration camp specifically for the Jewish occupants. Eisenhower's exact response to this horrific suggestion was not recorded. By this point, General Walter Bedell Smith, Brigadier General Adcock, and others had reached the conclusion that General Patton might be suffering from mental instability. Brigadier General Adcock's civilian deputy was Walter Dorn, a history professor on leave from Ohio State University. Mr. Dorn was of German heritage and was fiercely determined to eradicate all signs and remains of Nazism from Germany. When General Patton finally met Mr. Dorn, he disparagingly described him as a smooth, smart-ass academic type. Regardless of Patton's assessment of his academic nature, Mr. Dorn soon dedicated his focus to evaluating the ineffectiveness of the denazification program in Bavaria. He quickly discovered that the German administrative structure established on behalf of General Patton to run Bavaria was heavily infiltrated by former Nazis. General Patton had paid so little attention to the formation of this new administration that he could not even recall meeting its minister-president, a Dr. Fritz Schaefer. As a direct consequence of Mr. Dorn's discoveries and the controversial incident at Prisoner of War Camp 8, Mr. Dorn and Brigadier General Adcock, presumably with General Bedell Smith's full consent, took extraordinary measures. They arranged for a psychiatrist disguised as a supply officer to be assigned to General Patton's headquarters, with the explicit mission of studying his behavior. Furthermore, almost unbelievably, arrangements were made to tap General Patton's phones and to bug his residence. It is not clear what, if anything, the disguised psychiatrist reported. However, it didn't take long for the wiretappers to intercept General Patton expressing violently anti-Russian sentiments. He even suggested rearming former members of the Wehrmacht and utilizing them to help the United States Army force the Red Army back into Russia. In one particular conversation with General Eisenhower's deputy, General Joseph McNarney, General Patton allegedly went so far as to state that he could cause enough incidents in 10 days to trigger a war with the Russians and make it appear to be their fault. General Patton held 2 press conferences during the following month that proved disastrous for his career. At the first, held in Frankfurt on August 27th, he spoke out forcefully against the Russians and signed a letter proposing the release of some Nazi internees. This action reportedly angered General Eisenhower so greatly that he is said to have demanded that General Patton implement the denazification program exactly as ordered, rather than what he termed mollycoddling the goddamn Nazis.
However, General Patton refused to change his deeply held convictions. 2 days later, he recorded in his diary his view that the Germans were the only decent people left in Europe. He stated clearly that if he had to choose between the Germans and the Russians, he preferred the Germans.
An even worse incident soon followed. On September 22nd, General Patton agreed to take questions from reporters after his regular morning briefing at Bad Tolz. When questioned about the retention of Nazis in governmental positions in Bavaria, General Patton defended his policy. He stated that he despised and abhorred Nazism and Adolf Hitler as much as anyone, asserting that his record on that point was clear and unchallengeable, found on battlefields from Morocco to Bad Tolz. He then made his most infamous comment. He explained that more than half of the Germans had been Nazis. Removing all Nazi party members from office would place them in a terrible predicament. General Patton drew an analogy, stating that the Nazi question was very similar to a Democrat versus Republican election struggle. He argued that to restore order in Bavaria following 4 years of total war and complete disorganization, they had been forced to compromise with the devil to some extent. He insisted that they had no alternative but to rely on people who possessed the necessary knowledge and skills to execute the required tasks. Therefore, he concluded, they were compromising with the devil for the time being. He reiterated his personal distaste for the Nazis, recalling that he had done his utmost to kill as many of them as possible over the past 3 years. He concluded by explaining that they were now employing Nazis only due to the lack of better qualified people. The press immediately seized upon this story, particularly focusing on the Democrat versus Republican comparison. When General Eisenhower realized that the press reports were substantially accurate, he was appalled. He ordered General Patton to report to him in Frankfurt immediately. Due to severe poor weather conditions, it was impossible for General Patton to fly. When he eventually arrived on the 28th, after a strenuous 7-hour car journey in heavy rain, he was dressed uncharacteristically. He wore only an ordinary khaki jacket and standard government-issue trousers, having left behind his customary cavalry breeches, swagger stick, and pistols. General Patton was fully aware that he was facing serious trouble. During the 2-hour meeting, General Eisenhower was more excited than I have ever seen him, according to General Patton's diary notation. At one point in the tense discussion, Brigadier General Clarence Adcock, the officer responsible for United States Forces European Theater Civil Affairs, was summoned. Adcock brought Professor Walter Dorn into the room with him. Professor Dorn then ruthlessly and skillfully demonstrated that the administration established in Bavaria under Dr. Fritz Schaefer was thoroughly permeated with former Nazis. Once they were alone again, General Patton proposed that he should simply be relieved of command. General Eisenhower, however, informed him that he did not intend to relieve him, and that there had been no pressure from the United States to do so. General Patton then suggested that he should be permitted to retain command of both the Third Army and the government of Bavaria. Nonetheless, General Eisenhower's decision had been finalized. General Patton was instead offered command of the 15th Army. This unit was an army in name only, as its sole operational mission was to prepare an extensive history of the war in Europe. The only alternative offered to General Patton was resignation. General Patton ultimately accepted the position commanding the 15th Army. He rationalized his decision in his diary by noting that resigning would allow him to salvage his self-respect at the cost of his reputation, but he worried he would become a martyr too soon. He further justified his acceptance by writing that he was reluctant, indeed unwilling, to be complicit in the destruction of Germany under the guise of denazification. He maintained his belief that Germany should not be destroyed, but instead should be rebuilt to serve as a vital buffer against the true danger, which he identified as Bolshevism emanating from Russia. General Eisenhower concluded the meeting by advising General Patton to return to Bad Tolz as rapidly as possible. He informed General Patton that his personal train was ready to transport him at 7 o'clock that evening. General Patton's diary entry recording the end of this pivotal day simply stated, "I took the train." The subsequent day, General Bedell Smith contacted General Patton by telephone and read him a letter from General Eisenhower. The letter formally notified General Patton that he was to assume his new appointment on October 8th. When the news was publicly announced on October 2nd, many newspaper headlines, including that of the Stars and Stripes publication, declared that Patton fired. Some newspapers expressed sympathy. The New York Times wrote that General Patton had transitioned from contemporary controversy into history, where he would hold an honored position. The newspaper acknowledged that he had been in a post for which he was temperamentally, professionally, or experientially unsuited. They viewed his removal by General Eisenhower as an admission of that mistake. Despite his flair for showmanship, The New York Times described him as a scientific soldier and a dedicated military student, concluding that while he earned no accolades from the peace, the laurels he won in war would endure. General Patton's own letter to his wife Beatrice, written the day after his difficult meeting with General Eisenhower, reveals the deep turmoil within his mind. He claimed that the opposition against him was the sole method by which communists and Jews were successfully trying to implement the further dismantling of Germany. He concluded his letter by asserting his unwillingness to be the executioner to the best race in Europe. Reflecting later on the consequences of the fateful press conference on September 22nd, General Patton noted that it had cost him command of the Third Army, or rather, the command of a group of soldiers, mostly new recruits, who then still held that historic designation. He maintained that he had been intentionally direct because he believed the time had arrived for the public to know precisely what was happening. He conceded that his language was not particularly diplomatic, but stated that he had yet to discover where diplomatic language effectively produced successful governance. General Patton's primary motivation for establishing order in Germany was to prevent the nation from becoming communist. He expressed fear that the profoundly foolish and utterly stupid policies being enacted would inevitably cause the Germans to align with the Russians, thereby ensuring the establishment of a communist state across Western Europe. He concluded with the sad reflection that his final chance to earn his pay had passed, yet he felt he had done his best as God had provided him the opportunity.
On October 7, 1945, General Patton formally relinquished command of his beloved Third Army to another seasoned cavalryman, General Lucian Truscott. It was a rainy day, and the ceremony was conducted, somewhat inappropriately for the Third Army, inside a gymnasium. General Patton delivered a short farewell address, which began with the somber words, "All good things must come to an end," and concluded with a sincere, "Goodbye and God bless you." A band then played the tune "Auld Lang Syne," the Third Army flag was formally handed over, and General Patton departed to the music of the Third Army March and the familiar song, "He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Following a luncheon hosted in his honor, he boarded the Third Army train, heading toward his new headquarters in Bad Nauheim, situated 20 miles north of Frankfurt. Just before formally transferring command, one of General Patton's final acts was to present the Silver Star Medal to Master Sergeant John Mims, who had served as his driver for over 4 years. The award of the Silver Star to Master Sergeant Mims, who was preparing to return to the United States for demobilization, was surprising because the medal was officially intended to be bestowed for gallantry in action that did not merit the Medal of Honor or the Distinguished Service Cross. As a general's driver, even General Patton's, Master Sergeant Mims had clearly never been in direct contact with the enemy, and therefore could hardly have displayed gallantry in action. It might be speculated that General Patton viewed this particular award as an award given indirectly to himself, especially since the Silver Star was notably absent among his numerous personal decorations. This suspicion is reinforced by a comment General Patton made in a letter dated November 24th to Beatrice. In the letter, he mentioned that after fighting for 3 years, he finally secured the Distinguished Service Medal for all of his people, totaling 10 individuals. He found it amusing that nobody seemed to be trying to secure any medals for him. He pointed out that he received nothing for his actions in Tunisia, nothing for Sicily, and nothing for the Battle of the Bulge. He sarcastically added that Generals Bradley and Courtney Hodges had both been decorated for their failures during that operation. General Patton arrived at his new headquarters in the very early hours of October 8th. He was met by the officer who was temporarily holding the command, Major General Levin Allen, who had been General Bradley's former chief of staff. General Patton's initial words to General Allen were, "Well, you know damn well I didn't ask for this job, don't you?" The new headquarters was situated in an old hotel in Bad Nauheim. When General Patton entered the mess hall for lunch, approximately 100 officers stood to attention. In a successful effort to immediately ease the tension and break the ice,
General Patton's opening words to the gathering were, "There are occasions when I can truthfully say that I am not as much of a son of a bitch as I may think I am. This is one of them." General Allen later wrote that the relieved staff roared with surprised delight, and from that moment forward, the 15th Army staff supported him as wholeheartedly as the 3rd Army staff had. However, General Patton lacked genuine interest in commanding an army that had no combat mission and possessed no weapons. The 15th Army consisted primarily of historians and an administrative support staff. He announced that he intended to return to the United States by March 1946 at the very latest. He stipulated that he expected all the necessary historical reports concerning the European campaign to be completed by that time. Despite setting this deadline, General Patton took very little serious interest in the actual historical work. According to General Eisenhower's son, John, who was a lieutenant on the 15th Army staff, General Patton's main concern was ensuring that Patton's army was mentioned about 3 times as often as any other. Lieutenant Eisenhower himself felt that the First Army had contributed more significantly to the Allied victory. Few military historians who maintain an unbiased perspective would disagree with that assessment. Given his lack of commitment to the historical project, the question arises, how did General Patton occupy his time? He toured France, collecting what his aide claimed were enough certificates of honorary citizenship from liberated cities such as Avranches, Chartres, and Rennes to paper the walls of a room. He enjoyed luncheon with Charles de Gaulle, the unanimously elected president of the Provisional French government, and dined with the French Army's chief of staff. The majority of his time, however, was dedicated to preparing his personal book, War as I Knew It. Douglas Southall Freeman's introduction to War as I Knew It, which was published in November 1947, noted that Patton undertook the writing of this small book after the end of the hostilities. Freeman explained that the general drew extensively from his own diary for detailed information. Some sections of the narrative, Freeman observed, were nearly exact word-for-word reproductions of the diary text, with only personal references either toned down or completely removed. While the writing activities may have provided some intellectual satisfaction, they did little to improve General Patton's overall morale. He quickly became tense and moody. General Hobart Gay, his loyal chief of staff and a trusted friend, along with other staff members, observed that General Patton grew withdrawn. He frequently took long drives alone, spoke very little during meals, and often went home early. One staff officer later recorded that it was obvious that General Patton was experiencing deep and consuming internal distress. Sometime during the month of October, General Patton made a resolution to quit outright, not retire. He determined that for the remaining years of his life, he would be free to live exactly as he wished and speak whatever he desired. This resolution naturally caused concern for General Gay. General Gay surmised, almost certainly correctly, that General Patton planned to publicly criticize General Eisenhower's management of the European campaign. He also suspected General Patton intended to criticize other high-ranking officers, including General Bedell Smith, General Courtney Hodges, and even General Omar Bradley. General Gay counseled General Patton to consult with Beatrice and other family members before taking such a drastic step, but it seemed General Patton had firmly made up his mind. General Patton turned 60 years old on November 11th, and he was deeply touched to find that his staff had organized a surprise birthday celebration. The party was a gala evening held in the ballroom of the Spa Hotel in Bad Nauheim. General Patton found himself once again surrounded by friends and positioned as the center of attention. 2 weeks later, he was again thrilled to receive an invitation to travel to Sweden to address the Swedish-American Society. This trip, however, proved much more than a simple speaking engagement. General Patton traveled on a special train that had once been used by German President Paul von Hindenburg. He was formally greeted by the Chief of Staff of the Swedish Army and 8 former members of the 1912 Olympic pentathlon team. Later, he was received by the King and the Crown Prince. He also had breakfast with Count Bernadette. He had the pleasure of attending a specially organized ice carnival and hockey game in the Olympic Stadium. Perhaps the pinnacle of the trip was a reenactment of the 1912 Olympic pistol competition. General Patton finished in second place, achieving a score that was 13 points better than the score he had made during the actual competition in 1912.
The successful trip to Sweden marked the last significant highlight of General Patton's life. His final diary entry, dated December 3, details a luncheon hosted by General Bedell Smith for General McNarney, General Eisenhower's successor. General Patton's pervasive bitterness is strikingly evident in this entry. He wrote that General Clay, General Eisenhower's deputy, and General McNarney had never commanded anything, including, in his view, their own self-respect. He remarked that the entire luncheon gathering reminded him of a Rotary Club meeting in Hawaii, where everyone patted everyone else's back while simultaneously searching for a suitable spot to insert a knife. He admitted that he was also guilty of this practice, although at that specific moment he claimed to possess no appropriate weapon. 2 days later, General Patton penned his final letter to his wife, informing her that he was coming home for the Christmas holiday. He wrote that he had a month of leave, but did not intend to return to Europe. He stated that he would only stay if he could secure a really good job. Otherwise, he planned to retire. The logistics of his return included flying to London and then sailing from Southampton aboard the cruiser United States ship Augusta. The Augusta had previously served as the flagship for the Western Task Force during the invasion of Morocco. On the evening of December 8, General Gay suggested to General Patton that they spend the following day pheasant shooting. They planned to visit an area approximately 100 miles southwest of the headquarters, which was well known for being rich in game. General Patton enthusiastically agreed. He determined that hunting with a trusted old friend was the best possible way to spend his last Sunday in Europe. General Patton and General Gay departed from Bad Nauheim at about 9 o'clock in the morning on December 9th. They were traveling in General Patton's 1939 Model 75 Cadillac, which was being driven by Private First Class Horace Woodring. Following closely behind was a Jeep, driven by Technical Sergeant Joe Spruce, which carried the firearms and a gun dog. The fatal event occurred around 11:45 in the morning in the northeastern suburbs of Mannheim. An oncoming 2.5-ton United States Army truck suddenly swerved across the path of General Patton's Cadillac. The truck was attempting to turn into a quartermaster depot. Private First Class Woodring was unable to stop the Cadillac quickly enough. The two vehicles collided at a 90-degree angle, with the truck's right front bumper slamming into the Cadillac's bumper and radiator.
Neither of the drivers sustained injuries. General Gay received only minor bruises. General Patton, however, was severely injured. He remained conscious but was bleeding heavily from head wounds. These injuries occurred when he was violently thrown forward against the sturdy steel frame of the glass partition separating the rear and front seats, and then flung backward again into his seat. There were no seat belts in vehicles at that time. General Gay and Private First Class Woodring had seen the approaching truck and managed to brace themselves for the impact. General Patton, who had been looking out the side window, was completely unprepared for the collision. He immediately recognized the seriousness of his condition, allegedly murmuring, "I think I'm paralyzed," and later, "This is a hell of a way to die." An ambulance eventually arrived at the scene with 2 medical officers. General Patton was transported to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, which was 15 miles away. He was admitted at 12:45 in the afternoon. He was suffering from paralysis that extended from the neck downward, along with severe traumatic shock. His pulse rate was dangerously low, registering 45 beats per minute, and his blood pressure reading was 86/60. With his face and scalp covered in blood from cuts that had penetrated down to the bone, he was formally diagnosed with a fracture of the 3rd cervical vertebra, coupled with a posterior dislocation of the 4th cervical vertebra. At the time, doctors were left to speculate whether his spinal cord had been completely severed or merely severely traumatized. That evening, General Patton was placed in a rudimentary and extremely painful form of traction. The United States Army Surgeon General in Washington, District of Columbia, recommended bringing in a British neurosurgeon,
Brigadier Hugh Cairns, along with an orthopedic surgeon, to assist with his treatment. A military plane was dispatched to London to retrieve them. After their arrival on the morning of December 10th, they advised making several changes to the treatment plan, which regrettably turned out to be equally painful for the general. Fortunately, General Patton's medical condition gradually began to stabilize. After 9 days of intense agony, the traction was maintained and the pain was alleviated somewhat by encasing General Patton's shoulders and neck in a special plaster jacket. Beatrice, General Patton's wife, and an American neurosurgeon, Colonel Jeffrey Sperling, flew in from the United States, arriving on the 11th. General Patton's medical records for that day indicated that the prognosis for his recovery was becoming increasingly grave. Colonel Sperling and the other physicians were aware that it was impossible to perform surgery to relieve the pressure on his severely damaged spinal cord and thereby eliminate the paralysis. General Patton himself seemed to comprehend that his injuries were irreversible, if not outright terminal. His first words to his wife were, "I'm afraid, Bea, this may be the last time we see each other." As news of the sudden accident spread, rumors quickly began to circulate suggesting that the event leading to General Patton's death was not accidental. However, Carlo d'Este, General Patton's biographer, emphatically dismissed the idea of foul play. D'Este succinctly stated that those who proposed that General Patton was murdered failed to offer even the slightest shred of proof demonstrating how anyone could have successfully planned such a complex plot. Furthermore, they could not explain how conspirators could have guaranteed that General Patton's Cadillac would be momentarily detained for the passage of a train at the nearby crossing, which was situated just down the street from the actual collision site. The biographer emphasized that beyond a small number of men on his personal staff, nobody even knew General Patton's planned route, the exact time he would arrive at his destination, or precisely where he would be on that day. General George Patton Jr. died peacefully at 17:55 hours on December 21, 1945. The preceding afternoon, medical staff had needed to administer oxygen to restore his labored breathing. X-rays performed earlier had revealed that a small pulmonary embolism had obstructed his upper right lung. Beatrice spent the majority of the final afternoon with her husband, but left to eat supper when he drifted off to sleep around 17:15 hours. A doctor summoned her back around 1800 hours, but tragically, it was too late. Another, presumably larger embolism had struck his left lung, resulting in his death.
General Patton's body, respectfully draped with his personal 4-star flag, lay in state for 2 days. The viewing took place in the Villa Reiner, a 19th-century mansion that offered a beautiful view overlooking both Heidelberg and the Neckar River. Initially, Beatrice wished for him to be flown back home for burial at West Point. However, she was ultimately persuaded that this request would be entirely inappropriate because, up to that point, no American soldier had been sent home for burial. She was then given the option of choosing among 3 major United States military cemeteries located in Europe. She selected the cemetery at Ham, which is 3 miles east of Luxembourg City. On the 22nd, the same day the Stars and Stripes newspaper ran the headline, "Patton Dies," Beatrice drove to Bad Nauheim. Her purpose was to oversee the preparations for shipping her husband's personal belongings and effects back to their family home in Massachusetts. His beloved dog, Willie, was scheduled to follow later. Tributes recognizing his service and leadership had already begun to pour in. These messages would eventually include official communications from President Truman, French National Assembly, and British Prime Minister Clement Attlee. On the afternoon of the 23rd, General Patton's coffin was transported on an Army half-track vehicle to the Protestant Christ Church in Heidelberg. A short Episcopalian service was conducted by 2 Army chaplains, during which no eulogies were delivered. The escort consisted of a platoon from the 15th Cavalry, the very unit in which General Patton had begun his military career back in 1910.
General Walter Bedell Smith notably did not attend the service. This absence is hardly surprising, given that General Patton carried his profound dislike for both General Smith and General Eisenhower to his grave. Only 2 months before his death, he had informed General Eisenhower directly, "I cannot eat at the same table with Bedell Smith." Furthermore, before his passing, he explicitly told his wife, Beatrice, that he did not want either General Eisenhower or General Smith to attend his funeral. General Patton evidently never forgave General Eisenhower for the decision to remove him from the command of the Third Army.
Following the church service, General Patton's coffin was taken to the Heidelberg station. His wife Beatrice accompanied the coffin, supported by General Patton's longtime friend, General Jeffrey Keyes. The route to the station was lined by approximately 6,000 United States soldiers. At 16:30 hours, the train carrying the coffin began its solemn journey toward Luxembourg, arriving at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 24th. During the journey, the train stopped 6 separate times, allowing mourners, honor guards, and bands to pay their respects, despite the inclement weather consisting of heavy rain and freezing temperatures. The route stretching from the Luxembourg station to the United States Cemetery was lined by troops representing the United States, Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. The cortege was followed by Prince Felix of Luxembourg, 2 French generals, 1 Italian general, and a number of American generals, including General Truscott and General Gay. General George Patton Jr. was laid to rest at 9:30 hours on December 24, 1945. He was buried among other American soldiers, many of whom had died while serving under his command. The entire ceremony lasted exactly 25 minutes. In the final minute of the solemn ceremony, Master Sergeant William Meeks, the man who had faithfully served General Patton as his orderly since April 1942, presented Beatrice with the flag that had draped the coffin. Master Sergeant Meeks had tears in his eyes. A 12-man squad raised their rifles, and a 3-round volley of salutes echoed across the Luxembourg hills. The bugler then played the soft, mournful notes of taps, marking the end of the ceremony. The enduring image of General Patton Jr. is that of the quintessential warrior, a fighting general whose effectiveness on the battlefield was matched by his complex and often contradictory personality off it. His final months vividly exposed the profound challenges faced by such a dedicated combat leader in adapting to the unfamiliar demands of a fragile peace. The immediate post-war period was defined by General Patton's deep anxiety about the rising threat of the Soviet Union and the spread of Bolshevism. His outspoken, sometimes prophetic warnings concerning the necessity of confronting the Russians while the American army was still strong resonated with some military personnel and historians who viewed the failure to heed his advice as a grave historical and political error. He firmly believed that if the United States failed to maintain military strength, they would lose the ultimate purpose of the conflict. His suggested course of action, keeping the army intact and potentially pushing Soviet forces back across delineated borders, was politically infeasible, especially since most American soldiers simply wanted to return home. General Patton's interactions with the Soviet commanders, characterized by bravado and open contempt, further illustrated his confrontational attitude toward the new geopolitical reality. His dramatic confrontation with the Russian brigadier general over the riverboats exemplifies his preferred method of handling adversaries: assertive, overwhelming shows of force. His controversial tenure as military governor of Bavaria highlighted his unsuitability for detailed administrative and political tasks. His impatience with the intricacies of rebuilding a nation, coupled with his deeply troubling views regarding displaced persons, whom he described as worthless, and his growing anti-Semitism, revealed the darker aspects of his character. His melancholy was rooted in his conviction that the destruction of Germany, driven by denazification policies, was a mistake that would merely pave the way for communism across Europe. He saw the German people as the best race in Europe, and feared being the executioner of that race. The confrontation over denazification led directly to his downfall. General Patton's attempt to equate the removal of Nazis from government posts with simple political party rivalries in the United States caused outrage, particularly the comparison to Democrats and Republicans. This public relations disaster gave General Eisenhower and his staff, who were already concerned about his mental state and unpredictable behavior, the justification needed to remove him from the critical command of the Third Army and Bavaria. The subsequent offer of the 15th Army, a command focused entirely on writing history, was widely understood as a humiliating professional exile.
Despite the humiliation and his profound disappointment, General Patton's decision to accept the 15th Army command, rather than resign, was rooted in his belief that resignation would prematurely turn him into a martyr. He focused his remaining energy on preparing his book, drawing heavily and often verbatim from his diary, which provided a mental sanctuary from the political realities he despised. The circumstances of General Patton's death remain a subject of fascination and speculation, even today. The detailed account of the December 9th accident, involving a collision with a large United States Army truck in the suburbs of Mannheim, confirmed the official finding of a tragic, unforeseen event. However, the severity of his injury, a fracture and dislocation of the cervical vertebrae leading to paralysis from the neck down, was catastrophic. The fact that he was unbraced, looking out the window while his driver and companion had braced for impact, was a cruel stroke of fate. The subsequent 9 days of agony, culminating in his peaceful passing due to pulmonary embolisms, brought an end to the life of a leader whose luck, he himself had previously predicted, had finally run out. The legacy of General George Patton Jr. is complex. He is revered as an exceptional warrior, a natural leader of fighting men whose aggressive attack-based strategies, particularly during the Battle of the Bulge, shortened the war and saved many lives. His belief that the Americans should have been unleashed to continue their momentum westward is a powerful, persistent sentiment among his admirers. Yet the sources also confirm that he was a potential embarrassment to his superiors, a man whose volatile temperament and controversial political views required constant oversight. His inability to transition to a statesman or administrator role following the war underscores the idea that certain individuals are specifically suited for the demands of combat, but are utterly unfit for the nuances of peace and politics. It is noted by commentators that while he may have been a great war general, the business of politics and running a country would not have suited him. The decision regarding his final resting place also reflects his dual nature and ultimate commitment to his soldiers. While his wife initially desired burial at West Point, the eventual choice of the United States Military Cemetery at Hamm, Luxembourg, placed him among the American soldiers who perished under his command, particularly those who died during the critical Battle of the Bulge. This final detail ensures that the great general rests eternally, surrounded not by politicians or administrators, but by the fighting men he so effectively led. General Patton's life concluded not with the grand, climactic military engagement he desired, but with a sudden, ordinary road collision, an ironic and tragically mundane end for a man who believed his purpose was to command combat troops. He remains a figure defined by his fierce dedication to military science and his unwavering belief in offensive action, a man whose contributions to victory in the Great War are undeniable, but whose final struggles highlight the immense chasm between the requirements of war and the responsibilities of peace.